Picture this, a law that would force every single woman in your country to prostitute herself at least once in her lifetime. No exceptions. Rich or poor, married or single, young or old. This wasn't some dystopian fiction. According to ancient Greek historian Herodotus, this was the shocking reality of ancient Babylon, enforced by the most powerful religious institution of its time. Welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, hit that subscribe button because we're about to dive into one of history's most controversial and misunderstood religious practices. Before we begin, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from around the world. Today, we're uncovering the explosive truth behind the Babylonian priestesses of Ishtar, whose temples allegedly operated as organized houses of pleasure under the guise of religious devotion. But here's where it gets interesting. Modern historians have uncovered evidence that suggests everything we thought we knew about these women might be completely wrong. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this ancient scandal continues to spark heated debates among scholars today, and why the real story might be even more fascinating than the sensational tales that have captivated audiences for over 2,000 years. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you could ever imagine, and what we discover challenges everything we think we know about power, religion, and sexuality in the ancient world. To understand this scandal, we need to meet the goddess at the center of it all, Ishtar, known to the Sumerians as Inanna. She wasn't just any deity, she was the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and war, commanding more temples and wealth than almost any other divine figure in Mesopotamia. Her influence stretched across the entire ancient Near East, making her cult one of the most powerful religious and economic forces of the ancient world. Ishtar's temples weren't simple places of worship. Archaeological evidence reveals they functioned as massive economic centers, employing hundreds of women in various roles. These weren't humble religious retreats. We're talking about institutions that controlled vast amounts of land, livestock, and precious metals. The temple complex in Uruk alone employed over 1,000 women at its peak, making it one of the largest employers in the ancient world. The hierarchy within these temples was meticulously organized. At the bottom were the young initiates, often girls from wealthy families sent to serve the goddess. Above them were the specialized priestesses, the Naditu, who remained celibate their entire lives, the Kadishtu, who performed sacred rituals, and at the very top, the Entu, the high priestess who was considered the earthly bride of the god himself. But here's where things get intriguing. Ancient texts describe these women as wielding extraordinary power. They owned property, conducted business, and made political decisions that influenced kings and empires. The high priestess of Ishtar in Babylon was so influential that she could single-handedly determine the fate of trade routes and military campaigns. This wasn't typical for women in ancient societies, where they were usually excluded from public life entirely. The temples themselves were architectural marvels, decorated with explicit artwork that would make modern viewers blush. Carved reliefs depicted intimate encounters between gods and mortals, while ritual objects found by archaeologists leave little to the imagination about the nature of certain ceremonies. These weren't hidden away. They were proudly displayed as central elements of religious worship. The wealth flowing through these institutions was staggering. Records from the Neo-Babylonian period show that Ishtar's temple in Babylon received more tribute than the royal treasury. Gold, silver, precious stones, exotic animals, and thousands of tons of grain flowed into these sacred complexes annually. This wasn't charity. It was payment for services that went far beyond simple prayers and offerings. But what exactly were these services, and how did they create such massive wealth and power? The answer involves practices that would shock ancient and modern sensibilities alike, and reveals a system that was far more complex than simple religious devotion. Now we come to the account that has scandalized readers for over 2 millennia. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described what he claimed was the most shameful custom of the Babylonians. According to his vivid account, every woman born in Babylon was required by law to visit the temple of Aphrodite, his Greek name for Ishtar, and engage in intimate relations with a complete stranger before she could marry. The Greek historian painted a detailed picture of this alleged practice. Women would sit in the sacred precinct of the temple, wearing crowns of rope, waiting to be chosen. Men would walk among them, throwing coins into their laps and declaring their selection with the ritual phrase, "I invoke the goddess Mylitta upon you." Mylitta was another name for Ishtar, and once these words were spoken, the woman could not refuse, regardless of the amount offered or her personal feelings about the man. According to Herodotus, wealthy women who found this law repugnant would arrive at the temple in closed carriages, surrounded by servants, trying to make themselves as inaccessible as possible while technically fulfilling their obligation. They would wait, sometimes for years, until someone was willing to throw down a substantial sum, often gold rather than silver, to secure their compliance with this sacred law. The historian claimed that beautiful women completed this obligation quickly, while less attractive women might wait for 3 or 4 years before finding someone willing to pay their price. During this time, they couldn't leave the temple grounds, surviving on food brought by family members and donations from temple visitors. Some allegedly died waiting, having never fulfilled their religious obligation. But Herodotus provided even more disturbing details. He described a vast network of covered walkways within the temple complex, where these transactions took place away from public view. The money paid wasn't kept by the women. It belonged to the goddess, becoming part of the temple's incredible wealth. The women received nothing beyond the fulfillment of their religious duty and permission to marry. The scale of this operation, if true, would have been unprecedented, with hundreds of women present at any given time, and men traveling from across the known world specifically to participate. The temple would have been a bustling center of activity that generated enormous revenue. Foreign merchants, traveling dignitaries, and local citizens alike allegedly participated in this system that combined religious obligation with economic transaction. Herodotus also mentioned that similar practices existed in other parts of the Mediterranean, including Cyprus, and certain regions of Armenia, suggesting this wasn't unique to Babylon, but part of a broader religious tradition honoring fertility goddesses. He claimed that these customs were so deeply ingrained in local culture that violating them would bring divine punishment upon the entire community. The historian's account has been cited for centuries as evidence of the moral corruption of pagan religions, used by early Christians to justify their condemnation of pre-Christian practices. But modern scholarship has revealed problems with this narrative that call everything into question. Here's where the story takes a dramatic turn that most people never hear about. Modern historians have discovered compelling evidence that Herodotus likely never set foot in Babylon, despite his detailed descriptions of its customs and architecture. This revelation has ignited one of archaeology's most heated debates, with scholars questioning whether any of his sensational claims about Babylonian religious practices were actually true. The evidence against Herodotus is devastating. His description of Babylon's walls, which he claimed were so wide that 2 4-horse chariots could pass each other, doesn't match archaeological findings. His account of the city's layout contradicts both physical evidence and contemporary Babylonian sources. Most damning of all, his timeline for visiting the region doesn't align with historical records of his travels, suggesting he was in Greece during the period he claimed to be observing Babylonian customs firsthand. So where did these vivid descriptions come from? Scholars now believe Herodotus compiled his account from second-hand stories told by Greek merchants, Persian officials, and other travelers. Like a game of ancient telephone, each retelling likely embellished the details, transforming genuine religious practices into the scandalous narrative that has captivated readers for millennia. Dr. Sarah Melville, a leading expert on ancient Mesopotamian religion, has argued that Herodotus's account reflects Greek prejudices more than Babylonian realities. The Greeks viewed non-Greek cultures as inherently corrupt and immoral, making them predisposed to believe and spread the most sensational stories about foreign customs. What might have been ordinary religious ceremonies became transformed into tales of institutionalized corruption. Archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. Cuneiform tablets from actual Babylonian temples describe the daily activities of priestesses, and nowhere do they mention anything resembling the practices described by Herodotus. Instead, we find records of women managing vast agricultural estates, conducting diplomatic correspondence, and performing complex religious ceremonies that had nothing to do with intimate services for strangers. The debate has split the academic community into competing camps. Traditional historians point to the fact that Herodotus was generally accurate about other cultures he described, arguing that his Babylonian account deserves serious consideration despite its inconsistencies. Progressive scholars counter that the complete lack of corroborating evidence from Babylonian sources proves the entire story was fabricated. Recent discoveries have added fuel to this controversy. Tablets found in the ruins of Ishtar's temple in Babylon describe strict codes of conduct for priestesses, including severe punishments for any sexual impropriety. These rules directly contradict the permissive environment described by Herodotus, suggesting that if anything, these religious institutions were more conservative than typical Babylonian society, not less. The implications extend far beyond academic curiosity. For centuries, Herodotus's account has shaped Western perceptions of ancient Near Eastern religions, contributing to stereotypes about Eastern sexuality and morality that persist today. If the story is false, it represents one of history's most successful pieces of cultural propaganda, influencing attitudes about religion, sexuality, and cultural superiority for over 2,000 years. But this controversy has led historians to ask a more fundamental question. If Herodotus was wrong about the scandalous practices, what were these powerful priestesses actually doing that generated such massive wealth and political influence? The truth about Babylonian priestesses is far more complex and fascinating than the sensational accounts suggest. These women weren't victims of religious exploitation. They were among the most powerful and wealthy individuals in ancient society, wielding influence that extended far beyond temple walls and into the highest levels of politics and economics. Archaeological evidence reveals that priestesses of Ishtar controlled vast business empires. They owned factories that produced textiles exported across the known world, managed agricultural estates that fed entire cities, and operated lending institutions that financed everything from local businesses to international trade expeditions. The Nadatu priestesses of Sippar, who took vows of celibacy, were so successful in business that they became the dominant economic force in southern Mesopotamia for over a century. These women weren't restricted to religious duties. They were entrepreneurs, diplomats, and power brokers who shaped the course of ancient history. The archives of the Nadatu reveal contracts for everything from real estate development to international shipping ventures. One priestess named Amet Mamu accumulated so much wealth through her business dealings that she single-handedly financed the reconstruction of an entire district of Babylon after flood damage. But perhaps their most significant power came through the sacred marriage ceremony, one of the most closely guarded secrets of ancient Mesopotamian religion. This wasn't the crude practice described by Greek historians, but a sophisticated political ritual that legitimized royal authority. The high priestess, acting as the earthly representative of Ishtar, would perform a symbolic marriage with the king during the New Year festival. Without this ceremony, a ruler couldn't claim divine approval for his reign. The political implications were staggering. If the priestesses withdrew their support from a king, his legitimacy crumbled overnight. Historical records show several Babylonian rulers who lost power specifically because they failed to maintain good relations with Ishtar's temple. The priestesses weren't subservient to political authority. They were equal partners in governance, with the power to make or break dynasties. The wealth flowing into these temples was managed with sophisticated financial techniques that wouldn't be out of place in modern banking. Priestesses developed some of the world's first insurance contracts, offered loans with complex interest calculations, and created investment partnerships that spread risk across multiple ventures. The Temple of Ishtar in Babylon operated what was essentially the ancient world's first international bank, with branches and correspondents throughout the Mediterranean and Asia. Their influence extended into areas that would surprise modern observers. Priestesses served as judges in commercial disputes, negotiated international treaties, and even commanded military units during times of crisis. When Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, he specifically sought the approval of Ishtar's priestesses, recognizing that their endorsement was crucial for maintaining stability in his new territory. The educational system within these temples was remarkably advanced. Young priestesses received training in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature that surpassed what was available to most men in ancient society. The temple schools produced some of the ancient world's most accomplished scholars, contributing to advances in science and technology that influenced civilization for centuries. Perhaps most intriguingly, these women maintained extensive international networks that transcended political boundaries. Correspondence between priestesses in different cities reveals a sophisticated intelligence network that tracked political developments, economic trends, and military movements across the ancient world. They were among the best-informed individuals of their time, using this knowledge to protect their interests and those of their cities. The reality was that these priestesses had created a parallel power structure that operated alongside traditional male-dominated political institutions. They weren't challenging patriarchal authority directly, but had found ways to exercise enormous influence within the existing system through their control of religion, economics, and information. This reveals why the Greek accounts were so far off the mark. They were describing a system of female empowerment that was virtually incomprehensible to observers from male-dominated societies. The transformation of these powerful businesswomen and political players into the scandalous figures of Greek imagination didn't happen by accident. It reflects a systematic effort to discredit and diminish feminine religious authority that was spreading across the ancient world as patriarchal societies consolidated their power. Early Christian writers seized upon Herodotus's accounts as evidence of pagan corruption, using them to justify the suppression of goddess worship throughout the Roman Empire. Church fathers like Jerome and Augustine cited these stories as proof that pre-Christian religions promoted immorality, creating a narrative that persisted through medieval times and into the modern era. The real story of female economic and political power was buried under layers of moral condemnation and sensational fiction. This pattern of reinterpretation extended beyond Christianity. When Islamic forces conquered former Babylonian territories, they similarly transformed local legends about powerful priestesses into cautionary tales about the dangers of women wielding religious authority. The historical record was systematically altered to support prevailing political and religious orthodoxies. But the influence of these ancient priestesses didn't disappear entirely. Their business practices, legal innovations, and administrative techniques spread throughout the Mediterranean world, adopted by male-dominated institutions that erased their feminine origins. Modern banking, contract law, and corporate governance all contain elements that can be traced back to innovations developed in Mesopotamian temples by these remarkable women. Contemporary conspiracy theorists have latched onto fragments of this history, weaving elaborate narratives about secret societies of modern priestesses who allegedly control global finance and politics from behind the scenes. While these theories lack factual basis, they demonstrate the enduring fascination with the idea of hidden feminine power that the original Babylonian priestesses actually possessed. Archaeological discoveries continue to complicate our understanding of these ancient institutions. Recent excavations at CARNAL in Turkey have revealed extensive correspondence between Assyrian merchant families and Babylonian priestesses, showing that these women maintained commercial relationships that spanned continents. The scale and sophistication of their operations challenges fundamental assumptions about gender roles and economic organization in the ancient world. Academic feminists have embraced these priestesses as early examples of female empowerment, though this interpretation has sparked its own controversies. Some scholars argue that celebrating these women ignores the broader context of patriarchal oppression that limited opportunities for most ancient women. Others contend that focusing on exceptional individuals obscures the systemic nature of gender inequality in ancient societies. The debate has practical implications for modern discussions about women's roles in religious and economic institutions. Conservative religious leaders sometimes point to ancient restrictions on female religious authority as evidence of divine approval for male-only leadership, while progressive voices cite examples like the Babylonian priestesses to argue for greater female participation in religious governance. Perhaps most intriguingly, modern neuroscience research has begun to explore whether the religious experiences described in ancient temple texts might have involved altered states of consciousness induced by psychoactive substances. Chemical analysis of residues found in temple vessels suggests that certain ceremonies may have included mind-altering drugs, adding another layer of complexity to our understanding of ancient religious practices. The economic models developed by these ancient businesswomen have found unexpected relevance in contemporary discussions about alternative economic systems. Their emphasis on collective ownership, profit sharing, and community investment resembles modern cooperative and social enterprise models, suggesting that some of their innovations were centuries ahead of their time. This historical re-examination forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how power narratives are constructed and maintained across cultures and centuries. So, what's the final verdict on the scandalous priestesses of Babylon? The sensational stories that have captivated audiences for over 2 millennia appear to be largely fictional, products of cultural prejudice and historical telephone rather than eyewitness accounts. But the reality hidden beneath these myths is far more remarkable than the fabricated scandals. These weren't victims of religious exploitation or symbols of pagan corruption. They were pioneering businesswomen, skilled diplomats, and influential political players who created some of the ancient world's most sophisticated economic and social institutions. Their innovations in banking, law, and governance influenced the development of civilization in ways that are still being discovered by modern researchers. The persistence of the scandalous version of their story reveals more about the societies that preserved and promoted it than about the actual priestesses themselves. It shows how narratives of female empowerment can be systematically transformed into tales of moral corruption when they threaten existing power structures. Perhaps the most important lesson from this ancient controversy is the need to question historical narratives that seem too sensational to be true, especially when they reinforce convenient stereotypes about foreign cultures or marginalized groups. The real stories are often more complex, more nuanced, and ultimately more interesting than the simplified myths that replace them. The next time you encounter a historical account that portrays an entire culture as morally corrupt or fundamentally different from our own, remember the priestesses of Babylon. Their true story reminds us that human societies have always been more diverse, more complex, and more innovative than the prejudices of their observers would suggest. What other historical scandals might actually be stories of hidden power and forgotten achievements? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's most controversial mysteries. The past is never quite what it seems, and the truth is usually far more fascinating than fiction.